nation's destiny is in our sights. America's future is in our hands. And the best is yet to come.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post, and welcome to Washington Post Live's First Look, all about the Republican National Convention. Joining me this morning is the White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, Mr. Philip Rucker, but we'll just call him Phil. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning, Jonathan.
All right, so last night was night 3 of the RNC. Vice President Mike Pence spoke. What were your first impressions? What stood out to you?
You know, it was a very deliberate and careful effort by the vice president to try to portray President Trump as hard at work for the American people, despite the bluster and the chaos and at times dysfunction that we've all been chronicling. The vice president tried to convey that Trump is working for people, that his agenda is working, that he can revive this economy. And he also delivered a pretty ominous warning about what this country would be like under the leadership of Biden, were he to become the president. He said you would not be safe in Joe Biden's America. That's, of course, a message we've been hearing for all 3 days so far of the Republican National Convention, but one delivered by Vice President Pence last night, and really trying to scare voters into feeling like the unrest that we're seeing right now in Kenosha, Wisconsin, could be playing out all across the country if the White House ended up in Biden and Harris's hands.
Phil, you cover the White House. You're the White House bureau chief, and I'm wondering if inside the White House, within the administration, are the people around the president, do they really think that the messages coming out of the RNC this week will resonate not just with their hardcore base, but beyond that?
You know, they're hopeful that they will. They have no way to know, sort of in real time right now, how these messages are resonating. Certainly, they appear to be galvanizing the president's base, but as you alluded to, the base is clearly not enough for him to win re-election. He is behind in the polls nationally. He's behind in the polls in battleground states, and the key voting demographic that the Trump campaign is trying to reach out to with this convention, besides the base, is suburban women who were a key part of the president's coalition to help him win in 2016, especially in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. And they're trying to win them back. Women voters helped propel the Democratic majority in 2018 when Nancy Pelosi became the speaker again. And polls and focus group data tell us that they have fled from Trump and are backing Biden. Trump is trying to win them back with the scare tactics, with fear mongering, with trying to make them feel unsafe in this country, and trying to give them some reasons to think, okay, Trump may not be such a great guy, but he's done a few good things. We heard a few kind of anecdotes to try to present Trump as a man of character and a man of empathy, which of course is completely inconsistent with the public narrative about him, but nonetheless one that some of his aides tried to advance in their speeches last night.
And I'm glad you brought up, the narrative that they're trying to set through the convention, and how that's inconsistent with just sort of what we've been reading in the news and policies. And again, do folks inside the White House, or I don't know if you have any reporting via the Trump campaign, that they know that there are inconsistencies there, and they're just pushing forward because basically they have no choice.
They of course know that there are inconsistencies there. I mean, this is a president who has shown very little empathy throughout the coronavirus pandemic. He rarely talks about the hundreds of thousands of families that have been disrupted by deaths in this pandemic, or all the people who are suffering. You don't hear that from him very often. And yet, if you were sort of living on a different planet this year and came back to Earth to tune in to the Republican National Convention, you would think that the president has such a warm, open heart, and that he's been so empathetic and caring throughout the pandemic. That's a deliberate effort by the speakers at the convention to reach out to an audience that may not necessarily be paying attention to political news, and might believe some of these messages, and might It might give them a reason. They may have been considering not voting for Trump again this time. Might give them a reason to come home and vote for him in November. That seems to be their strategy.
Well, Phil, tonight is night 4 of the Republican convention, the last night, and the big marquee speaker is President Trump. What are you looking forward to from his speech tonight?
Well, we'll see what he has to say. I want to hear what he has to say about the pandemic in particular. Does he accept any responsibility for the management of this crisis? Does he make any sort of vow to the American people that he will do better, that he will try to fix what's clearly not working? It would be unusual to hear him say that, but talking to a Republican strategist outside of the Trump campaign the last week or so, they have felt that the president would be best served by taking the pandemic on directly, acknowledging some of the slip ups and mistakes, and vowing to do better, pledging to do better. So we'll see if he has that to say. Another thing we should look out for, and our colleague Glenn Kessler and the team at the Fact Checker are going to be pretty busy tonight, is just how many falsehoods we may hear from the president tonight. One thing that has stood out throughout this convention, including in the speeches last night, is how many misstatements, how many falsehoods, and in some cases outright lies have been uttered from that stage. And just one that was particularly jarring last night. There was a speaker who suggested that Joe Biden was a Catholic in name only. Of course, Joe Biden is a practicing Catholic. He has talked extensively about how his faith has guided him through some of the worst pain that anybody could go through: losing a wife, losing a baby daughter, losing an adult son, and to hear that from the stage was unusual.
Well, Phil Rucker, you have had a busy week. You are going to especially have a busy night tonight. Thank you very much for coming on First Look. Phil Rucker, White House Bureau Chief for the Washington Post.
Thank you.
All right, let's cross over to the opinion side of the Washington Post and talked with my colleagues, Ruth Marcus and Charles Lane. Ruth Marcus is the deputy editorial page editor, and Charles Lane is a member of the editorial board and a Washington Post columnist. And I'm just going to call you Chuck, Charles. I can't call you Charles. I'm going to call you Chuck. Good morning to good morning to you both. Chuck, I'm going to start. I want to start with you. You wrote a column earlier in the week about the decline of religious commitment in the country, and I want to read your words back to you. A major source of this country's relative social and political conservatism is essentially disappearing, with potentially far-reaching implications for everything from criminal justice to education to foreign policy. And last night, we heard from Vice President Pence, one of the more religious leaders within the White House in the modern era, who describes himself as a born-again evangelical Catholic. So given that, what did you make of his speech?
Wow, that's a lot to deal with all in one question. To the point about declining religiosity in America, that's been a trend that has been coming for a number of years, but seems to have really accelerated in the last 10 to 15 years, according to the data I cited in my piece. And I think one reason you have a figure like Mike Pence is the sense of Christians that they are embattled, that the main institutions of the popular culture are lined up against them, countering their values, so on and so forth, but also that they're losing their own people through sort of defections, really, among young people who, to a large extent, were driven off by the social conservatism, to some extent, of certain faiths. And so the feeling of sort of demographic embattlement of Christian, in this case, we're talking about white Christian America out there in the Midwest, with whom Mike Pence is an avatar, is a part of the emotional energy of the Republican coalition, to the point where they feel so desperate that they're willing to, embrace a figure like Donald Trump, who clearly isn't very religious himself, and pretty clearly doesn't, in his own personal life, practice, a whole lot of, conservative value.
Ruth, before I ask you your question, was that our third guest
That
barking
was
or howling in the
so
background?
so that is my dog who has been very compliant and quiet through many, many live events, but somehow seems to start to whine during Washington Post Live. So I apologize to everybody, but I think he's quieted down.
I'm go-
But
I'm
I
gonna.
just want to say it'd be worse if I set him outside the room. So
Uh-huh. Well, I'll
the
take the
dog barks
howling.
our way.
I'll take the howling as, roars of approval rather than booing. So, Ruth, one of the controversies swirling around this convention is the use of the White House and government employees speaking at a political convention, and everyone's talking about this thing called the Hatch Act. And you wrote on Twitter that what bothers you most about the president's use of the office is not the technical violations of the Hatch Act, but the hypocrisy of his actions. Flesh that out.
It's not simply the hypocrisy, and the just a few things about the Hatch Act. It does not technically apply to the president, though there are some criminal parts that apply to the president. But look, the reality is that we're holding a convention during an unusual time, and it's going to call for some unusual measures and unusual settings to make sure that you can keep everybody safe, including the president. So that's fine. I would allow a little bit more leeway in terms of using the White House. And by the way, the White House was used by Jimmy Carter as the backdrop for his election reannouncement. It was used by Ronald Reagan as the backdrop for his election announcement. So uh, presidents before have used the White House, but not like this. This is astonishing. And I was a little bit resistant to join the crowd of, oh my God, Hatch Act violations, string them up, until I saw the real transformation of the People's House into a reality television stage. When he used it to conduct a naturalization ceremony, and then apparently without the knowledge of some of the people who were gaining their citizenship, used it as a political tool. When he used one of the most awesome powers that's granted to the president, which is the power to pardon, and turned that into another segment of reality television. When Melania Trump used the Rose Garden and didn't even bother to do what I think she knows is the appropriate thing to do, which is to make sure people are masked and socially distanced. That is just a misuse of federal resources. And it's not, when I say misuse of federal resources, I don't mean that it's a legal violation. I mean, it's a kind of moral and norm violation that we just shouldn't permit, and we shouldn't tolerate, and we should speak up about. And there's actually quite a good op-ed, if I might use the platform, in the Washington Post today by Tina Chen, who was the chief of staff to First Lady Michelle Obama, about her response to this and the care they took in the Obama administration to make sure these kinds of things didn't happen.
Yesterday here on First Look, our colleague Hugh Hewitt, when I asked him about the Hatch Act, whether it was being violated, and he said, absolutely not. There's nothing to see here. This is no big deal. Is Hugh right? Given what you've just said, or does he go too far in saying that there's nothing to see here?
I think it's I think he's answering the wrong question. We can parse the intricacies of the Hatch Act, but the point is more, what is the right way to proceed at this time? Every president has advantages of incumbency. I remember being on a campaign trip with President George H.W. Bush, and the majesty of he was leaving the convention and arrived with this fantastic Air Force One flyover. Presidents have built-in advantages, but there are ways to use the office and there are ways to not use the office. And easily, there was no need for the president to have serving Marines in their dress uniforms, opening the door for him so he could stride in and conduct his reality TV show. It's not right. It's why no president has done it before, Democrat or Republican.
Chuck, I want to ask you a question, bouncing off something we were discussing in our editorial board meeting yesterday, and this is from the New York Times today. And this is focusing in on primarily Vice President Pence's speech last night. The intense focus on the rioting amounted to an acknowledgement by Republicans that they must reframe the election to make urban unrest the central theme and shift attention away from the deaths and illnesses of millions of people from the coronavirus. And then I would add, shift the focus away from from the peaceful protesters who are protesting in favor of Black lives and against the killings, the police involved killings of unarmed African American men. Why is the reframing of the discussion important to the Trump White House?
Well, first of all, I want to say I have a cat, so there's not going to be any problem on my discussion. But to your very serious question, you know, the American people are being told in a way, by both parties that this is like the Flight 93 election. Again, remember that in 2016, there was that famous essay by an anonymous person, later turned out to be Michael Anton, who became a Trump aide, saying, this is our Flight 93 election, conservatives. We have to go with Trump no matter what, because if we don't, we'll lose America as we know it. And Democrats have been painting a very stark sort of disaster scenario about losing our democracy if there's another 4 years of Trump. And there was no comparable theme available to the Republicans this time around because Trump's the incumbent, you know. But somehow these riots, the urban violence, the latest of which we've seen in Kenosha, have now supplied that kind of Flight 93 narrative. And I have to say, I think it is extremely effective and potentially, and is going to require real political skill by the Democrats to counter. You saw Joe Biden say yesterday, go on with about a 3-minute video statement about the violence in Kenosha, where he began by lamenting the shooting of Jacob Blake and calling for justice in that case, and then pivoting to a kind of unequivocal condemnation of the arson and looting that had spilled over into the streets of Kenosha. And that's the balancing act the Democrats are going to need if they're going to effectively counter this theme. Because as the violence in the streets in various cities has kind of percolated along, it has taken a lot of the focus in the media generally off of peace. Frankly, there have been fewer peaceful protests recently. And so there's just been more visual of the stuff in Portland. And that's frightening to some people. And I think that it's going to be a real challenge. I think it's doable for Biden. I think that's what Biden's strength is as a candidate, is that he is not personally perceived as somebody who tolerates violence or excuses violence or anything like that.
I mean, I don't know if I buy your contention, Chuck, that there have been fewer peaceful protests. I would perhaps argue that those peaceful protests are being the pictures from them are being broadcast less frequently than they were in May and June. Ruth, let me get your perspective on this. How effective will the law and order argument be? And I mean, do you agree with Chuck that the visuals of violence and tear gas and police and riot gear, will that inure to the president's benefit?
Well, to channel my inner Donald Rumsfeld, you go to the campaign and you go to the convention and you go to the election with what you've got. The president does not have a strong hand to play, notwithstanding the completely substantiated claims last night and previously, and I'm sure we'll hear it again tonight, of his fantastic handling of the coronavirus. He does not have a strong hand to play about the economy right now. He does not have a strong hand to play about his compassion and empathy as much as Kellyanne Conway and Kayleigh McEnany tried to present that last night. So what is he? And he doesn't have an opponent who he can credibly depict as a sort of socialist nutcase, as he's trying to do. So I think that the law and order opening has been an opening for Trump and the Republicans. It's what they have. I think that it's a risk, perhaps not as big a risk as Chuck is portraying, but it is definitely a risk for Democrats and for Biden. And I think he did try to navigate that tension last night or yesterday, and will do so again. But the notion, as Vice President Pence put it last night, that you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America, I think remains a really tough and somewhat laughable sell.
One more quick question on this before I move on to another topic. How does the arrest of, as I'm calling him, the militia teen, who has now been arrested for shooting two people, killing, I think, one of them, maybe two of them, walking around the streets after shooting them openly in front of the police with an AR-15 and not being confronted, not being arrested? Doesn't that trample on the White House's message about law and order, or does it serve to amplify their message? Because to my mind, having a white teenager walking on the street openly with an AR-15 only serves to amplify the arguments being made by the peaceful protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement. Chuck.
Well, it depends where we're going to start the story, because it's also a fact that when the protests began in Kenosha, I'm talking about the violent one, there were AR-15s in that group too. So I think this is just like everything else in America right now, Jonathan. Nobody is going to look at it except through the lens of their priors. I wish that were not the case. I wish there were a large group of people who were reserving judgment and deliberating and waiting for all the facts and then balancing them and in an unbiased manner. But of course, part of the reason I believe this Republican convention may be more effective than we realize is that it's not about what's actually happening. It's about supplying people with a ideological or framework in which to interpret what is maybe they think happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so no, I don't think there'll be any impact on Trump's. No person who is going to vote for Trump is going to waver because of what you just described.
Mm-hmm. Ruth?
Well, no person who's going to vote for already knows that he or she is going to vote for Trump is going to waver right now. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the very small band of folks who have not already decided, who may have voted for Trump 4 years ago and been turned off by what he's done, and it is possible that those folks may look at violence in the streets and get nervous, though that's the suburban mom group, right? But the reality is that this is a very unfortunate set of facts for the Trump campaign, that this young man who's accused of killing the protesters in Wisconsin was recently at a Trump, I gather, in the first row at a Trump rally. We can't, I'm not assigning cause and effect. It's a very dangerous and irresponsible thing to do, but that is not what you would want to set up as you are talking about the threats of violence in the country. This is not the fact pattern that you would want to throw out there.
But they had a couple from St. Louis who were brandishing weapons outside their house of protesters to speak at the convention. So maybe it is what they want. I mean, it is.
People manage not to shoot anybody.
Well, I don't think they would have avoided shooting if they had to. It's again, guys, I mean, I think we have to be aware that there is another world from where we live here in Washington, where these events are being processed and perceived. I just want to emphasize that Minnesota right now is a toss-up state. think about that for a minute. That Minnesota is within the margin of error, one of the most democratic states in the union. And it is also the place where, blocks and blocks of Minneapolis, were set on fire and looted. It's where George Floyd lost his life as well. But I'm just trying to say, like, as we sit here today, 2 months after George Floyd's death, the political advantage in that state seems to have shifted slightly toward the Republicans, and I think that's significant.
And
But
I, I
there's
should
simultaneous
go ahead, Ruth.
realities going on. There are 180,000 people dead. Um, and those are not the direct result of President Trump, but his handling of the coronavirus did not help. And so the Republicans can talk about rioting in the streets, but Democrats can talk about a lot of dead Americans and a lot of out of
Um,
work Americans.
I take your point, Chuck, about Minnesota. President Trump lost the state by about a little more than 1%. Last night, I woke up this morning to stories about downtown Minneapolis last night. Dealing with looters, and also to your point about a completely different reality being broadcast. I mean, the Republican convention has been playing to the folks, as I've said before, who have been spending a lot of their time not watching CNN or MSNBC, but watching Fox. And so for them, what they're seeing is a feedback loop. But I'll move on to a completely different subject. Well, almost completely. It's still on the reelection. More than 100 prominent alumni from the last three Republican presidential nominees, President George W. Bush, the late Senator John McCain, and former Massachusetts governor and the nominee from 2012, Mitt Romney, have come out in favor of and are endorsing Joe Biden. The Chamber of Commerce is backing Joe Biden. And I'm wondering, does that even matter? Do those endorsements matter from establishment Republicans for Joe Biden, Ruth?
Well, I think they matter for the historical record for sure. They matter because we've seen such fecklessness on the part of elected Republican officials who are understandably but still shamefully so scared of Donald Trump and the fury of his base if it's unleashed on them that they won't stand up and speak back to the president even when they know he's wrong. So for this number of people, and since I'm in the shameless plugging business, see a very good op-ed from Mark Salter, one of John McCain's top aides in your Washington Post as we speak. So for the historical record, yes. For maybe some of those undecided voters, some of the suburban moms and others who were a little bit shaky on which way they would go, I think every little brick in this wall of opposition to Trump is another brick in a pretty growing wall, and it's the one that's getting built, I guess.
Is Mexico paying for it? Chuck, we've got 2 minutes left. What's your view? Do those endorsements from prominent alumni from the previous Republican nominees, does it matter in the grand scheme of things?
Probably about as much, excuse me, and I'm going to be blunt here, probably about as much the ultimate outcome of this election as the parade of African American endorsers of Donald Trump is going to affect the outcome. It's the same kind of, play against type optic that's being developed. I would argue that in a way, Trump is probably celebrating that all those establishment Republicans, maybe rhinos, Republicans in name only, are showing their true colors. They've always been liberals and sympathetic to the Democrats all along. It will enable him to make his argument even stronger with his base. I mean, I'm not sure these days, like, who out there in America is really excited about who's getting the Chamber of Commerce's endorsement for president. I know that the Chamber of Commerce really cares because they have a lot of lobbying irons in the fire and they're worried about that. But honestly, those guys have been out of the Republican Party, which is a Trump operation now, and they've been out of it for some time.
But you
Um,
see these Republican voters against Trump. You see the folks who have just left the administration, the Miles Taylors, who also wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, and others. And people understand this is not normal. This is not Republican business as usual. Something different is going on here.
Okay.
And I would just add, the Republicans
Sure to
brought out,
We
Republic-
can't stop.
the Republicans brought out the current Democratic mayor of a small town in the Iron Range of Minnesota to show like Democrats are, white working class Democrats are abandoning
Yeah,
that
but the
party.
numbers are not equivalent.
Yes,
We're
there are
gonna have
more
to
white
leave it-
working class voters than
And
establishment.
this is life at the Washington Post.
I was going to say, everyone, what you are seeing right now is a Washington Post editorial board meeting in real time. Ruth Marcus, Charles Lane, thank you very much for coming on First Look this morning.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
We'll be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. for a final look at the Republican National Convention, an analysis of President Trump's speech with Washington Post national political reporter Michelle Yee, fact checker Glenn Kessler, who is going to probably have a very busy night, and Washington Post columnists Henry Olson and George Will. Coming up at 12:30 this afternoon, Washington Post Live will speak with Ken Blackwell, a prominent Trump supporter and senior fellow at the Family Research Center. And at 4 p.m., my colleague Bob Costa will be here to speak with senior counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway. You can register to watch these interviews at WashingtonPostLive.com. In the meantime, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Have a good afternoon.